scientifically impossible, is the entire geologic column itself. Now, we talked during number 6 in the Cambrian explosion a little bit about the geologic column, but now for number 7, we're going to address the entire geologic column. Now, some call it geologic column, some call it geological column. Bottom line, there are some things called polystrate fossils within the geologic column that show the evolutionary timeline is just scientifically impossible. At the top of the geological column is the Quaternary period, and then you kind of work your way down through the ground. And this is according to the evolutionists. Quaternary period near the top. Then below that, the Tertiary period, then Cretaceous, then Jurassic, then Triassic, then Permian, then Pennsylvanian, then Mississippian, then Devonian, then the Silurian, then Ordovician, then Cambrian, and then below that, the Precambrian rock. So that's the geological column. You have all seen this in school textbooks. Everybody sees it. There's a sheet. It's a geological chart. Everybody can see this chart. It's on walls in schools all over the country. I'm going to tell you something right now that most people do not know. And this is something that many creation scientists were never taught when they were in school. This is information they had to find out on their own. That geological column that you see on the geological chart does not exist in real life in the ground. Let me say that again. The geological chart does not exist in that order in real life in the ground. It only exists on paper. In real life, when you dig down into the ground, those layers are not in the order that they're supposed to be. They're not in the same order that they are on the geological chart. When you drive through a mountain on the road and you see all of those layers, you can tear your geological chart page out of your geology book from school, take it to the side of the mountain that's cut through and hold it up there, and you'll see that in real life, the layers are upside down, inside out, inverted, mixed with each other. It's as though you took a deck of cards and you shuffled them, and they're mixed in all the wrong places. Half of them are missing. They're missing in this area, and then different layers are missing in that area, and the different layers are missing over in this third area. And in all of the areas, they're all upside down and mixed and all out of proper sequence. Just like it should be if there was a big flood and random mud sloshing everywhere. That would make sense. So you need to know this, first of all. The geological column doesn't exist. Go to the Grand Canyon, take your geological chart, hold it up there, and you'll see they're all out of sequence. Half the layers are missing in any given place you look in the earth. And the layers that are there are all in the wrong place. What they have done, what the evolutionary scientists have done, is come up with a geological column that they want to consider an average for the whole Earth. And this is what they've done, but they've put it on paper. It doesn't exist in real life. So you need to know that first of all. So you say, well then, Bob, what about the polystrate fossils? What are polystrate fossils? Here's what they are. Polystrate fossils are nothing more than fossils that stand up vertically and punch through a bunch of these so-called layers. Let's say you're looking at an area cut into a mountain, where a road cut through a mountain, and you see those different layers. And we'll say an evolutionist will tell you, okay, see this layer, from that layer to that layer, that represents 100 million years ago to 120 million years ago. And then below that, that layer to the next layer down represents 120 million years to 150 million years ago. And then you go on down the line. What happens if you saw a fossil of a tree standing upright vertically, punching through about 4 or 5 of these layers? What would you think then? That's a polystrate fossil. What that shows is that those layers could not represent these hundreds of millions of years, because the tree would have lived and died long before it could exist long enough for the Earth to gradually rise up around that tree over the span of 50 million years. Do you know that there are literally tens of thousands of these kinds of polystrate fossils all over the Earth? I have seen the photographs of these. Any creation scientist can tell you about them. They are all over the planet. It's just the photographs of the ground and the layers in the ground with a polystrate fossil in them are never going to be put in the school textbooks. You need to know that. So yeah, I'd like the evolutionists to explain to me how those layers in the geological column represent millions and hundreds of millions of years, when right over there's a tree punching up through 4 of those layers. Now, what if the Noah's Ark story is true? What if those layers in the geological column don't represent millions of years of existence on Earth, but they actually represent just the natural laying of giant mudslides from a worldwide flood? How might that explain the polystrate fossils? Well, let's make some scientific predictions again. And for this, I want to tell you a story about Mount St. Helens. Do you know when Mount St. Helens erupted back in the 1980s? The blast was so severe that the forest in the area literally was laid bare. And you'll notice this, you can see this anywhere in the world where a volcano goes off and there are some trees, a forest nearby. What happens is this: the energy in the blast is so strong that the trees are stripped bare. Literally, all of the branches are stripped off of the trees, and the trees are yanked out of the ground, broken off at the base. The roots don't even come out of the ground. The trees themselves are ripped literally off the ground with the roots still in the ground, and all of the branches and leaves are stripped off of the trees, and you have what looks like, in essence, a bunch of telephone poles. We saw this after Mount St. Helens. It's been photographed. It's been videotaped. And I'm sure you've seen the images as well after Mount St. Helens, the thousands upon thousands of what look like telephone poles just strewn all over the ground. And a lot of these, thousands of them, also floated out into the lakes. And they would create log mats. And so, many people have seen these, many people have studied these. It's really a fascinating concept. You get these huge log mats comprised of thousands and thousands of what look like telephone poles that are nothing more than trees from the forest that were stripped bare and broken off above the roots. And so what they do is they float on the water, and this was observed in the 1980s. They floated on the water, thousands of them, and they would eventually get waterlogged. And eventually, they would end up sinking to the bottom. But they didn't sink horizontally. What they did as they got waterlogged was they eventually turned up vertically and then floated in the water, bobbed in the water. That's how logs end up becoming waterlogged. So then when you looked at the lake, you could see hundreds, even thousands of these trees that were now upright and bobbing in the water. And eventually, as they became completely waterlogged, they sunk lower and lower and lower until eventually they went below the surface and they shot straight down to the ground like a torpedo and punched into the mud at the bottom and sank down vertically into the mud. That is what actually happened. This isn't a theory. This is what actually took place, what was actually observed. So we now know when volcanoes go off, this is what happens to trees. We now know this, and they end up in water, and then when they become waterlogged, we know that they go upright, and we know that they sink down vertically and punch through the mud. Now let's go back 4,500 years to the time of Noah's Ark and the flood of the world. If there were a worldwide flood, as the Bible says, and if we had the springs from the deep bursting forth and water coming out, we would have had continental shift. The continental shift would have triggered volcanic activity all over the earth. Volcanoes would have been going off left and right. When volcanoes went off, we would have had the very same thing happen back then that happened in the 1980s at Mount St. Helens. We would have had forests all over the earth, where the trees would have been stripped bare, they would have been broken off, they would have looked like a bunch of telephone poles floating in the water all over the earth. Then they would have, as they got waterlogged, went upright, sunk down to the bottom, punched into the mud, and then as the rest of the mud sloshed around, they would have come around the trees, they would have layered naturally. And guess what? That is exactly what we see in the so-called geological column all over the earth today. Literally tens of thousands of vertical trees with no roots on the bottom and no branches on them that look like telephone poles, exactly like the ones from Mount St. Helens did, all over the earth, littering the entire so-called geological column throughout the entire planet. So I'm telling you, it is, I believe, in my opinion, just logical to accept that that's really what the geological column is, especially when we see these polystrate fossils. Oh, and by the way, just so you know, the Bible also tells us that the mountains broke forth at this time as well. The continents during Noah's flood, the continents would have been shifting. As they would have been shifting, you would have had a buckling effect take place on the land. You know, much like if you put a blanket on the floor, if you pull the blanket, it's going to stay flat. But if you try to push the blanket, you're going to get some ripples and some buckling in that blanket. And that's what would happen on the earth. If the continents were being shifted at a fairly rapid rate, you would have a buckling effect. You would have mountains punching up. And this is exactly what the Bible tells us happened, that the mountains were created. The mountains came forth. They punched up. The valleys were created as well. But if that's true, if the Bible story is true, you know what that means? That means that whatever was at the bottom should have ended up at the top. In other words, some of the things at the bottom, some areas at the bottom of the sea should have been pushed up through this rippling effect and become the tops of mountains. So if that's true, we should predict that the tops of mountains should have some fossils of invertebrates on them, right? Clams and jellyfish and worms and trilobites and all that stuff should be at the tops of mountains around the world too, if they used to be the bottoms of the oceans that were pushed up through this buckling effect during the continental shift. And guess what? On mountain tops and mountain ranges all over the earth, you find invertebrate fossils at the tops of these mountains. Fossils of worms and clams and jellyfish and trilobites. Did you know that? All right, number 8.